"Don't drink that, Mr. Calloway. Please, don't touch the glass." Walter Calloway set down his pen and looked up from the long conference table with the practiced patience of a man who had spent 40 years in a courtroom and understood that interruptions came in all forms. The glass of water sat to his right, beaded with condensation placed there 20 minutes ago by the building's catering staff before the signing began. Around the table sat 7 people, lawyers, estate managers, a notary, and one silent observer near the back wall who was not supposed to be there at all. Becca Chen was 9 years old and had no business being in a private will, signing on the 14th floor of Calloway and Merritt. Her mother, June Chen, was the firm's head paralegal, and she had run out of options that morning when the school called at 7:45 to say the pipes had burst and classes were canceled. She had tucked Becca into the small supply room off the hallway with a library book and a granola bar, and strict instructions not to move. Becca had moved. She had followed the sound of voices to the conference room doorway, which had been left 2 inches open by the last person through. She had stayed behind the door frame, watching, because the view through the gap showed a room full of adults in serious clothes doing something that felt important. She had also watched something else. "Please," Becca said again, louder this time. Her voice came through the gap in the door like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone at the table turned. Walter looked toward the door. A small face was visible in the narrow opening. Dark eyes, a yellow barrette, a library book, clutched against her chest like a shield. June Chen appeared from the far hallway at a near run, her heels loud on the marble floor. She pushed through the door and grabbed Becca by the shoulders, her face going white in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with fear of consequences. "She is so sorry," June said, her voice pulled tight. "She knows she is not supposed to be here. Becca, come with me right now." Becca did not move. She pointed at the glass of water to Walter's right. She put something in it. I watched her do it. The table went quiet. Every head turned slowly toward the person seated at Walter's left, the one who had poured that glass from the pitcher and placed it there herself, explaining pleasantly that the caterers had left the service short and she didn't mind helping. Her name was Harriet Voss, and she had been Walter Calloway's estate attorney for 16 years. She wore a slate gray blazer, silver at her ears, and the careful expression of a woman who had learned long ago that a controlled face was its own form of armor. "That is quite an accusation," Harriet said. Her voice was even. Professionally even. The kind of evenness that comes from depositions and difficult cross-examinations. She looked at Becca the way one might look at a child who had wandered into traffic, not with malice, but with a brisk certainty that the child was confused and needed to be removed from the situation before anyone was harmed. "Becca," June said again, pulling at her daughter's arm. "I'm not lying," Becca said. She didn't pull away. She stood exactly where she was, her sneakers planted on the conference room carpet, the library book now pressed so hard against her chest that the spine was leaving a mark on her shirt. "I was watching through the door." She reached into the side pocket of her jacket. She took out something small and shook it into the glass. Then she put it back. Harriet pressed her fingers lightly to the table. "I poured the water from the pitcher that everyone at this table has been drinking from all morning. You can see the same pitcher right there." She gestured to it. "If I had put something in Mr. Calloway's glass, I would have had to do it in front of 8 people, which seems like an unusual method for someone you are implying intended harm." A few of the estate managers exchanged uncertain glances. The notary, a heavy-set man named Gerald who had done 3 signings with Harriet over the past decade, cleared his throat. "The child may have seen someone adjust the glass," he offered. "The catering staff were in and out." "I watched them leave," Becca said. "They left before she came in." The edge of Harriet's mouth tightened, just slightly. June saw it. She had worked in this building for 11 years and had sat across from Harriet Voss in drafting meetings and estate reviews and client consultations, and she had never seen that particular expression cross the woman's face. "June," Harriet said, "please take your daughter out of this room. There is a signed confidentiality agreement attached to this proceeding, and a minor's presence here is a liability for the firm." June's hands tightened on Becca's shoulders. Walter had not yet spoken. He sat at the head of the table with his pen still in his right hand, watching the child with the focused attention of a man who had spent his career, deciding which witnesses were telling the truth. He was 63 years old, a senior partner, the kind of man who had not survived 4 decades in law by ignoring things that didn't add up. He had not yet touched the glass. "Becca," he said. His voice was quiet, careful. She looked at him. What did it look like, what she took out of her pocket? It was small, Becca said, like a breath mint container, but clear. She shook 2 little things into the water. They were small and white. She did it fast. The room was very still. Walter looked at the glass, at the water inside it. Then he looked at Harriet. She had not moved. She had not reached for the water pitcher to pour herself a cup. which was what an innocent person might do to demonstrate the point. She had not laughed. She had not looked at the glass with the casual disinterest of someone who knew there was nothing wrong with it. She was looking at Becca with an expression that was managing itself too carefully. Walter set his pen down. "Harriet," he said slowly, "why don't we take a short break?" Harriet's eyes moved to him. "Marcus," she said, and then stopped. Because his name was Walter, not Marcus, and they both knew it, and the slip was so small and so strange that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the conversation. She recovered in under a second. "Walter, of course, if you need a moment." His chief of staff, a lean man named Arthur Fenn, who had been sitting against the wall and said nothing for the past several minutes, was already on his feet. Walter met his eyes across the room. The look that passed between them was brief and sufficient. Arthur stepped into the hallway. His phone was already in his hand. Harriet smoothed the front of her blazer. She looked at June. "You should take the child down to the lobby. There are soft drinks in the vending machines near the security desk. I am sure this has been an unsettling morning." Becca looked up at her mother and then back at Walter. "Don't drink it," she said again. "Even if they say it's fine, please don't drink it." June tightened her arms around her daughter's shoulders. She isn't going to do what she is supposed to do here, June realized. She had known her daughter since the beginning, since the 3 a.m. feedings and the ear infections and the first day of kindergarten. And she knew that Becca did not make things up. And she knew that Becca, once planted, did not move. There was something almost unbearable about watching your child stand in the middle of a room full of powerful adults and refuse to be managed. "Mr. Calloway," June said, and the words came out smaller than she intended. "I apologize for this, but my daughter doesn't say things she hasn't seen." Walter looked at her for a moment. He nodded once. He did not pick up the glass. The break lasted 4 minutes. During that time, Arthur Fenn made 2 calls. The first was to the building's head of security. The second was to Walter's personal physician, who kept an office on the 7th floor and answered on the second rings because he had been expecting a different kind of call about Walter's health for the past month and was relieved and then not relieved by what Arthur told him instead. The conference room held itself in a particular kind of silence during those 4 minutes. The estate managers looked at their folders. The notary studied his hands. Harriet Voss sat with her back straight and her face composed and her eyes moving from the door to Walter to the glass and back again in a rotation that she may not have been aware she was performing. Becca sat in a chair near the window that June had pulled her into. She held her library book and did not read it. When Arthur came back, he was followed by Raymond Dexter, the building's head of security, a former detective who had worked property crimes in Philadelphia for 22 years before taking this position. Raymond did not announce himself. He simply came to stand near the table with the particular stillness of a man comfortable in rooms where something had gone wrong. He looked at the glass. He looked at Harriet. He did not touch anything. "Nobody touches that glass," he said. His voice was quiet and did not require repetition. "Nobody moves it. Nobody removes it. Nobody adds to it." Harriet's composure held. She was remarkable in that way. There was not a flinch, not a tremor, not the slightest visible adjustment of her expression. She said, "I want it on record that I am cooperating fully with whatever process this is, and I also want it on record that I find it extraordinary that the word of a child who was not authorized to be in this room is sufficient grounds to halt a legal proceeding that has taken 6 months to schedule." Nobody said anything to that. Walter stood. He moved carefully, the way men in their 60s move when they have been sitting for a long time, and their joints have not kept up with their ambitions. He came around the end of the table and crossed to where Becca was sitting by the window. She looked up at him. Her feet did not reach the floor. He crouched down so that they were closer to eye level, which took some doing and which he did anyway. "You saw this happen," he said. "Yes, sir. Where were you standing?" "By the door, the one that goes to the hallway. It was open a little. And what did Ms. Voss look like when she did it?" Becca thought about that, she said. She looked at the door first, both ways, and then she did it fast, like she practiced. Walter held her gaze for a moment. He had cross-examined expert witnesses, sitting U.S. senators, and one particularly difficult forensic accountant who had lied about stock transfers for 11 years. He knew what a person looked like when they were constructing a story, and he knew what they looked like when they were reporting one. He stood back up. He looked at Raymond. "Get the glass to a lab," he said, "and I would like someone to stay with Ms. Voss." 2 things happened quickly after that. The first was that Raymond made a call that brought 2 more security staff into the room. The second was that Harriet Voss asked for her handbag, which was under the chair to her left, and Raymond said politely that he would prefer she leave it where it was for now. It was that moment, the handbag moment, that changed something in the room. The estate managers, who had been holding their discomfort carefully all morning, seemed to release it at once. One of them, a younger woman named Clara, who had been hired by the firm 6 months ago and knew Harriet Voss only by reputation, looked at the bag under the chair, and then looked at Raymond, and then looked at her hands. She had been sitting 12 inches from Harriet Voss for the past 2 hours. Walter's physician arrived 12 minutes later. Dr. Paul Nakamura was 60 years old, compact, unhurried, the kind of doctor who had learned over 30 years of practice to move calmly through situations that were not calm. He came into the conference room and looked at the glass on the table and took a sample kit from his bag. He worked without speaking. He tested the water with the same quiet efficiency that Raymond had secured the room with. After 90 seconds, he looked at Walter. "The preliminary strip shows a sedative compound," Paul said. "I can't tell you which one without a full panel, but it's there." The room absorbed that. Harriet had been looking at the window. When Paul spoke, she did not turn her head. Raymond asked her to stand. She did. She asked whether she was being detained. He explained what she already knew, which was that she was being held pending the arrival of people with more authority than a building security director. She asked for her attorney. He said that was her right. She sat back down with the practiced composure of a woman who had prepared for this possibility from more than one angle, which in its own way told a real deal. June was still beside Becca near the window. Becca had finally opened her library book, though she was not reading it. She was watching the room with the particular attention of a child who had been told her whole life to be quiet in grown-up spaces and had recently learned that this was sometimes exactly the wrong advice. Walter crossed to them again. June stood when he approached. "Mr. Calloway," she began. He raised one hand gently. He looked at Becca. "How long were you watching before you said something?" Becca thought. "A few minutes. I didn't know what she was doing at first. I thought maybe it was medicine." But then she looked at the door again before she put them in, and she closed her hand fast when she heard someone coming. "You waited," Walter said. "Even after you were sure." She hesitated. The book in her lap shifted. "I was scared. You would say I made it up." The room was quiet enough that everyone heard it. Walter's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the sedative that had almost entered his bloodstream. He had walked into this room this morning confident in the people around him, in the 16-year professional relationship that had outlasted 2 of his 3 marriages, in the ordinary trust one places in a glass of water set down by a familiar hand. He looked at his glass on the table. Still sitting there, still beaded with condensation, a completely ordinary object that had almost ended a great deal. He looked back at Becca. "You were right to say something," he said, "even though you were scared." She nodded then carefully. "She's good at looking like nothing is wrong." Walter held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "she is." The police arrived 35 minutes after Raymond's call. They were followed shortly by a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit who had, it turned out, been building a separate file on Harriet Voss for the better part of 8 months. His name was Fletcher Webb, and when he walked into the conference room and saw the glass still sitting on the table with a preliminary positive test beside it, he went very quiet in a way that meant something to people who knew him. "He's been looking for a thread," Raymond told Walter quietly. "That glass may be the whole sweater." What Walter learned over the following hours came in pieces, the way bad news usually arrives, slowly enough that the mind has time to prepare for each new part without being crushed by the whole. Harriet Voss had been Walter's estate attorney since he was 47 years old. She had drafted his first real trust, managed the paperwork when he bought out his founding partner, renegotiated his firm's liability structure after a malpractice claim that had cost him 3 years of sleep. He had invited her to his second wedding, and she had come. He had not invited her to his third wedding, because it had been small and fast and over before anyone was notified. But she had sent flowers anyway with a note in her precise handwriting. He had trusted her with everything that could be trusted to a person who was not family. She had used that access with a patience and precision that Fletcher Webb found difficult not to admire even as he documented it. In the 14 months since Walter had begun considering retirement, Harriet had introduced minor adjustments to the estate documents she managed on his behalf. Small changes in beneficiary language, a clause in the trust amendment that created a 6-week window of administrative authority in the event of Walter's incapacitation. A provision in the power of attorney structure that named her as secondary administrator, should the primary administrator be unavailable. Taken alone, each change was defensible. A careful attorney reviewing complicated estate work might question them, might ask for clarification, might note the unusual clustering of these amendments toward the end of the document and ask whether the client was aware of the cumulative effect. But Walter had been busy. He had trusted her. He had signed what she placed before him, with the distracted confidence of a man who had good people managing his affairs and chose to believe that good people stayed that way. There was also the matter of the buyer. Fletcher Webb set a folder on the table in front of Walter at 6:20 in the evening, when most of the estate managers had gone home and the room smelled of cold coffee and the kind of silence that follows long hours of difficult information. The folder contained communications between Harriet Voss and a private equity group that had been attempting to acquire Walter's senior partnership stake in Callaway and Merritt for the better part of 2 years. Walter had refused their initial approach. He had declined their follow-up. He had declined 3 more times through channels he considered final. The private equity group had been patient. Harriet had brokered an understanding with them that predated Walter's first refusal. The arrangement was structured around a simple premise. If Walter Callaway was incapacitated, the temporary administrative authority Harriet had quietly built into the estate documents would allow her to act on his behalf for a window of 6 weeks. That was enough time to authorize a preliminary transfer of the partnership stake, which under the new document language would trigger automatically upon a signed letter of intent from the acting administrator. She had drafted the letter herself, Fletcher told him, dated it 2 weeks ago. It was in her home office on a printer, unsigned, because she had been waiting for a reason to sign it. Walter looked at the folder for a long time. She planned for me to be incapacitated at the signing, he said, when the documents were already in front of me. Yes, Fletcher's voice was careful. A sedative compound would have produced confusion and disorientation within 20 to 30 minutes of ingestion. Enough to impair judgment and arguably void the proceedings. Enough to trigger the incapacitation clause she had inserted. And if I was confused enough to sign something I didn't understand while still technically conscious. That's what we believe she was hoping for, yes. The glass would have been enough either way. If you became visibly unwell and the signing was stopped, the incapacitation clause was her next move. If you signed while impaired, she had what she needed and a record of your consent. Walter closed the folder. He had known Harriet Voss for 16 years. He had known June Chen for 11, and he had not known her daughter's name until that morning. That fact landed on him in a way he had not expected, and which he sat with quietly while Fletcher continued. Arthur came to stand beside him at some point in the early evening. June had taken Becca down to the lobby an hour ago, after Becca fell asleep against her mother's shoulder in the conference room chair, the library book, sliding from her lap and landing open-faced on the carpet. June had carried her daughter's things in one arm and guided her down the hall with the careful precision of a woman shepherding something fragile through a world that had not always been designed for it. Arthur had watched them go. She tried to stop me, Walter said to no one in particular. Yes, Arthur said. She stood in that doorway with a library book and tried to stop a room full of adults who didn't believe her. Walter's throat was tight in a way he would not have admitted to in the courtroom and was prepared to admit to now, alone with his chief of staff in a room that smelled of cold coffee and the residue of something almost irreversible. I kept writing, he said, while she was standing there. I almost finished the signature. Arthur didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say. Harriet Voss was charged that evening. Her attorney arrived within 40 minutes, which was efficient and suggested prior arrangement. The private equity group's local representative, a man who had been staying at a hotel 4 blocks from the building, checked out at 9 p.m., but Fletcher's team reached him. He made it to the airport. He did not make it to the gate. 3 weeks later, the amended trust documents were voided. The administrative authority clauses were removed and replaced with language that Walter reviewed line by line himself, which took 2 full days, and which he considered some of the most important reading he had done in 40 years of legal work. On a Wednesday morning in October, June Chen arrived at the office to find a message asking her and her daughter to come to the senior partners' conference room at 9 a.m. Becca wore her school uniform and carried the same library book, which she had finished, and was now on her second read. She sat in one of the large chairs along the wall and looked at the room with the particular attention of someone who had been in it before under different circumstances. Walter arrived at 9:10, which was late for him. He was carrying a cup of coffee and a small wooden box that he set on the table in front of Becca. She looked at it. "You can open it," he said. Inside the box was a sealed envelope, and beneath it, a folded letter on firm stationery. The letter explained that Callaway and Merritt had established an educational trust in Rebecca Chen's name. It covered tuition through graduate school at any institution she chose. It included a modest annual stipend for materials, housing, and the occasional library book. Becca read the letter slowly. She was 9 years old and some of the language required a second pass. Then she looked up at Walter. "This is a lot," she said. "Yes," Walter agreed. "I didn't do it for this, I know." She thought about that. Then she said, I was scared you would be mad. Walter sat down across from her and set his coffee aside. He leaned forward slightly, the way he had crouched down to her level in this same building 3 weeks ago. I was not mad, he said. I was wrong. I should have put that glass down the moment you asked me to. I should have listened to you before I looked around the room to decide whether you were worth listening to. Becca absorbed that. She looked at the box. Was she your friend? She asked. Walter took a breath. I thought so, he said. For a long time. Becca nodded slowly, the way she nodded when something was sad but also made sense. That's worse than a stranger, she said. Walter looked at her. Yes, he said. It is. June had been standing near the window during all of this, holding her coffee with both hands, watching her daughter sit across from a senior partner in a room full of legal history and speak with the frank directness that had never been convenient and had turned out to matter more than convenience. Walter signed the trust documents that afternoon. June notarized them, which she did slowly and precisely because her hands were not entirely steady, and which she considered the most important thing she had ever certified. In the months that followed, the case made its way through the system, with the methodical pace of things that are serious enough to be handled carefully. Harriet Voss's attorney argued diminished capacity, then argued duress, then argued procedural errors. None of it moved the evidence, which was complete and thorough and included a small, clear container found in Harriet's jacket pocket that afternoon, which turned out to contain 11 more of the same tablets that had been dropped into the water. Becca went back to school on a Thursday. She did not tell anyone what had happened, because she was 9 and it was a lot, and she hadn't figured out how to explain it yet. She sat in class and paid attention and checked out a new library book at the end of the day. She also, for the first time in her life, told her mother that night that she wanted to be a lawyer. June looked at her over the dinner table. Why? She asked. Becca shrugged. Because lawyers get to ask the questions, she said, and everyone has to answer. June thought about that for a moment. She thought about Walter Calloway crouching down to her daughter's eye level in a conference room. She thought about the glass of water that had sat on a polished table while her daughter stood in a doorway and said, the thing no one wanted to hear. That's not a bad reason, she said. Becca picked up her fork. Also, she said, I want my own office. June laughed. It came out fuller than she expected, the kind of laugh that had been waiting in her chest for 3 weeks looking for a way out. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary evening, traffic and amber light, and the sound of someone's radio drifting up from the street below. Somewhere across town, in a building that no longer felt the way it used to, a glass of water had been collected and cataloged and stored somewhere. Evidence goes when the truth has already done its work. And at a kitchen table, in a one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor, a 9-year-old girl who had stood her ground in a room full of adults was eating dinner and planning her career, and her mother was watching her and trying to decide if this was the moment she would remember for the rest of her life, or only one of them. She decided it was both.